Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good evening. Okay, so the next two chapters are fairly short, so I'm going to read chapter 2 and 3 out of uh, the Hiram Key tonight. We'll just jump right on into it. So, chapter 2, the search begins. Where did the order originate? A great number of well-informed men have set out before us to try and find the origins of Freemasonry, and they overlooked none of the obvious possibilities, nor did the ranks of the romancers and charlatans who have joined in the hunt. For some, the line is simple. Freemasonry is only as old as its publicly recorded history, the 17th century, and everything purporting to predate those records is whimsical nonsense. This pragmatic attitude is uncomplicated, but it is the easiest of hypotheses to reject for many reasons, as we will show, not least the fact that there is widespread evidence to show that the order materialized slowly over more than 300 years before the establishment of the United Grand Lodge of England. From the establishment of the United Grand Lodge of England in 1717 onwards, the order has been open about its existence. Only its methods of recognition have been kept from public gaze. But the organization that we now call Freemasonry was a secret society before the mid-17th century, and secret societies, by definition, do not publish official histories. We therefore decided to look into the possible history of the craft before it went public, and felt that there were three serious theories that had received consideration from Masonic historians. Sorry. Okay. Number one, that Freemasonry is as ancient as the Masonic ritual claims. It was indeed created as a result of happenings at the building of King Solomon's Temple and has been passed down to us through mechanisms unknown. Two, that it is a development of medieval stonemasons' guilds whereby operative Masonic skills with stone were translated into what Masons called speculative Masonic skills of moral improvement. And three, that Masonic ritual originates directly from the order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, now better known as the Knights Templar. The first theory, that Freemasonry was the creation of King Solomon, struck us as impossible to research because the Old Testament is the only source, so we pursued it no further at that time. The second one, that medieval stonemasons developed the craft for their own moral improvement, is a theory that has found acceptance in virtually every quarter, Masonic and non-Masonic. Nevertheless, despite the apparent logic of this idea and the large number of books that have promoted this idea over many generations, we found it difficult to substantiate once we considered it in depth. For a start, despite rigorous research, we were completely unable to find any records to show that medieval stonemasons' guilds existed at all in England. Had they existed, we felt certain that some trace would still remain. In many European countries, they certainly did exist, and there is plenty of evidence of their activities. Gould's History of Freemasonry carries page after page of crests of the guilds of stonemasons across Europe, but none is British. Such workers were skilled artisans in the employ of the church or rich landowners, and it seems unlikely that their masters would have been enlightened enough to permit some form of proto-trade union, even if the workers had developed a desire for such a unifying body. Many of them would have spent their entire lives working on a single building, such as a cathedral, and the need for secret signs of recognition and passwords struck us as a non-existent when these masons were trundling around the same building site for 50 years. Some stonemasons in the Middle Ages were illiterate and would have had little or no education outside of their apprenticeship, which provided only craft skills. To imagine that they could have understood, let alone have originated, as complex a ritual as that now used by Freemasons strains credibility. Their vocabulary, and most likely their ability for abstract thought, must have been very limited indeed. Travel for all but the most highly skilled master masons was a rare event, so secret signs, grips, and passwords would not be of much value. And even if they did travel from one building construction to another, why would they need secret means of recognition? If someone falsely claimed to be a stonemason, it would not take long to spot their inability to work stone. As many kings and their mightiest lords have been Freemasons from the order's known beginnings to the present, see appendices. We could not imagine the circumstances in which a band of noblemen turned up at a stonemasons' gathering asking if they could copy their proceedings to use them in a symbolic manner for their own moral betterment. We found the definitive evidence to dispose of the stonemason theory when we studied what are known in Freemasonry as the Old Charges, the oldest of which is believed to date back to the late 15th century. It sets out rules of conduct and responsibility for Freemasons, and it has always been assumed that these were taken from the codes of conduct belonging to medieval stonemasons' guilds. One of these charges stated that, quote, no brother is to reveal any legitimate secret of another brother if it might cost him his life and property, end quote. The only legitimate Masonic secret at that time that would automatically carry such a penalty if discovered by the state would have been heresy, a crime that surely would not have been committed or condoned by simple Christian stonemasons. The question we asked ourselves was, why on earth would heresy be anticipated as a possible guilty secret of these castle and cathedral builders? It did not make sense. Organizations do not evolve important rules in case one of their number might one day be secretly guilty of a crime against the church. Clearly, whoever originated this old charge was aware that every brother lived with the danger of being branded a heretic. We were certain that these rules were not created by simple stonemasons, but for a group that lived on the fringes of the law of the land. Having satisfied ourselves that there was no evidence to support the stonemason theory, and plenty to damn it, we became increasingly puzzled as to what kind of people the ancient charges could have referred to. Another charge from the same period, much discussed by historians, indicates a very clandestine ancient purpose. This refers to the provision of employment for a visiting brother for the period of 2 weeks, after which time, quote, he should then be given some money and put on the road to the next lodge, end quote. This is the kind of treatment that one would expect to be extended to a man on the run, seeking safe houses as he goes. Yet another charge prohibits Masons from having sexual relationships with the wife, daughter, mother, or sister of a brother Mason, which would be an absolute necessity to maintain the safe house system. To come home and find a Masonic guest in bed with one's wife or daughter would rather strain the oath of brotherly charity. We could not imagine what possible heresy this early Masonic group could have been guilty of to create such a highly structured system of recognition and survival outside the church and state. In addition to these factors which discredit the stonemason's theory, it is essential to remember that the central imagery that runs right through Freemasonry is the building of King Solomon's temple. There is no link connecting medieval stonemasons to this event, but there must be there most certainly is where the third theory is concerned, the Knights Templar theory. Actually, I don't know if they're going to get into it, but on that second theory of the stonemasons possibly being heretics or being accused of heresy, could it be that they were Cathars? Or what's the other one? Um, they both existed mostly in France, I think, though, not in Britain. There was a Cathars and something else that's like a man's name. What am I thinking of? Anyway, Anyway, but they were all considered heretics, so that would kind of explain it, in my mind, anyway. Okay, so back to the book. The Knights Templar, or to give them their full title, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, were formed almost 600 years before the establishment of the Grand Lodge of England. If there is a connection between these crusading warrior monks and Freemasonry, we will have to explain the gap of 410 years between the sudden demise of the order in October 1307, which is when the Cathars were being taken out, I think, is roughly the same time, and the formal appearance of the craft. This break has prompted many observers, Masonic and otherwise, to dismiss suggestions of a link as wishful thinking. Some have published books to show that the supporters of this theory are mere romantics predisposed to believe esoteric nonsense. More recently, available evidence has, however, strongly shifted the weight of argument in favor of the Templar Freemasonry connection, and our own researches have put it beyond any doubt at all. Before we look at the formation of this fascinating order, we examined the circumstances of the building that gave the Templars their name and Freemasonry its theme. We found that there were the Temple of King Solomon is the title of this section. We found that there were, in the wider sense, 4 temples associated with Mount Moriah in the city of Jerusalem. The first was that built by King Solomon 3,000 years ago. The next never existed in stone. It was that seen in a vision by the prophet Ezekiel during the captivity of the Jews in Babylon in about 570 BC. Imaginary though this temple was, it cannot be ignored as it has had a significant effect on later Jewish writings and beliefs that passed down to Christian belief. The third was built by King Zerubbabel in the early part of the 6th century BC, after the Jews returned from their Babylonian captivity, and the final temple was being erected by Herod at the time of Jesus Christ and was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70, just 4 years after its completion. As we were later to discover, Solomon set about creating many great buildings, including a temple to house the God we now call Yahweh or Jehovah. Both names are attempts at translating from Hebrew a form of writing with no vowels. Solomon is often referred to as a wise king, but as we progressed in our researches, we discovered that the designation wise had been bestowed on all the builders and kings who sponsored buildings for thousands of years before Solomon, as will be demonstrated later. The Jews themselves had no architectural heritage, and none of them had the building skills required to erect anything more than a simple wall. Consequently, the temple at Jerusalem was built by craftsmen hired by Hiram, the Phoenician king of Tyre. Despite the name, it was clear to us and every previous observer that King Hiram has nothing to do with Hiram Abiff. The ritual of the Holy Royal Arch degree, which we will discuss further in chapter 13, makes it very clear that Hiram, king of Tyre, or Tyre, some people say, supplied the materials, whilst another individual, Hiram Abiff, was the actual architect of the temple. It even mentions that these 3 individuals, Solomon and the 2 Hirams, held an important lodge and were the sole joint holders of the true secrets of a master mason. Despite a commonly held Masonic view that this temple was a landmark in the history of building, Clark and other experts consider its style, size, and layout to be almost a carbon copy of a Sumerian temple erected for the god Ninurta 1,000 years earlier. It was a small building, similar in size to an ordinary English village church, and believed to be less than half as big as Solomon's palace. We can guess at where the great king's priorities lay when we discovered that the building to house his harem was at least as big as Yahweh's temple. From a knowledge of the purpose of churches, synagogues, and mosques, it would be easy to assume that Solomon's temple was a place where the Jews worshipped their God. This, however, would be a mistake, as this temple was not constructed to be visited by men. It was quite literally the house of God, a home for Yahweh himself. There are no physical remains of the Temple of Solomon, and there are no independent records of it, so no one can be sure whether or not it really existed. It might be an invention of the later Jewish scribes who wrote down their verbal traditions long after the alleged building took place. They tell us that the most famous of all temples was built of stone and completely lined inside with cedar brought from Tyre. The walls are said to have been 9 cubits, about 13 foot 6 inches, thick at their base, and rose to support a flat timber roof of cedar topped with fir. The distinguishing characteristic of the temple was the amount of gold which covered the floor, walls, and ceiling, set amongst carvings of cherubim and open flowers. The interior was 90 feet long and 30 feet wide, and the whole building was aligned from east to west with a single entrance at the eastern end. A partition with a pair of folding doors set into it divided the interior into 2/3 to 1/3 split, creating a cube 30 feet in height, width, and length. This was the oracle of the Old Testament, also called the Holy of Holies and known in Masonic ritual as the Sanctum Sanctorum, which was completely empty except for a rectangular box of shittim wood, acacia, the 4 feet long by 2 feet wide and 2 feet high, placed in the exact center of the floor. This was the Ark of the Covenant, which contained just 3 things: 2 tablets of stone bearing the 10 Commandments, and the God Yahweh himself. On top of it was a thick sheet of solid gold and 2 wooden cherubim, themselves heavily covered with gold, with outstretched wings guarding the precious contents. These cherubim were not the chubby, haloed flying infants popular with Renaissance painters. They would have been Egyptian in style, looking exactly like the figures depicted on the walls and sarcophagi of the pyramids. The Holy of Holies was in permanent darkness except for once each year on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest entered with the blood of the national sin offering, the scapegoat. After the high priest left, a large chain of gold was placed across the doors, sealing off the smaller chamber from the larger. According to later Jewish tradition, this room was used by the priests and Levites, hereditary priests, alone, and it contained a gold-covered cedar altar placed square on just in front of the doors, and of course outside of the eastern doorway stood the 2 pillars, Boaz and Hakin. I don't know how to pronounce that one. Jachin. If somebody knows, let me know. This, then, was the building that the Templars venerated as the central icon of their order, but it was the ruins of another temple that they excavated, built almost exactly 1,000 years later on the same site by the famous King Herod. Why, then, we wondered, did they choose to name themselves after Solomon's temple? Conclusion. We had easily decided that the stonemason theory of the origin of Freemasonry does not hold up under close examination, for the simple reasons that guilds of stonemasons did not exist in Britain. The fact that they existed on the continent is not relevant because Freemasonry did not develop in the areas where these European guilds were formed. The protocol found in the ancient charges of the order and their obligation to provide work and a concern about ensuring the protection of the female relatives of brothers seemed to us to be much more fitted to a secret society rather than a group of itinerant builders. We had searched long and hard, spending hundreds of hours in various libraries, immersed in reference books, but try as we might, we could not find any connection between King Solomon's temple and medieval stonemasons. History had told us that there had been 3 temples of stone on the site, and one imaginary one that could not be ignored as it had inspired many people down the ages. The original temple built for Solomon was a small Sumerian-type building, smaller than his harem, erected to house the troublesome storm god Yahweh rather than as a place of worship. Yahweh himself lived inside the Ark of the Covenant, which was housed in the Holy of Holies of the temple, an area known to Freemasons as the Sanctum Sanctorum. This ark was constructed and decorated in an Egyptian style, and at the eastern doorway of this first temple stood the 2 pillars known to Freemasons as Boaz and Hakin. The idea that the order might have come down from Solomon himself as a continuous secret society hidden from the world seems completely impossible, and we were left through a process of simple elimination with just one plausible origin to investigate. We knew that the first Knights Templar had excavated the site of the last temple, and many writers had suggested connections between these knights and Masonry. And that is the end of chapter 2. These, like I said, these are fairly short chapters. At least these 2 are. I'm going to jump right on to the next one. Chapter 3, The Knights Templar, the Beginnings of the Order. The image of a brave crusader wearing a white mantle decorated with a red cross and sporting a full beard, slaying the wicked and protecting the good, is one that most of us have been familiar with since childhood. The reality was quite different. The red cross on the white robe was the garb not of all crusaders, but of a group of warrior monks, the Knights Templar. Their mysterious rise from nowhere, their subsequent massive wealth and influence, and their sudden and total fall from grace on Friday the 13th, October 1307, has made them the subject of debate and imaginative speculation from that day to this. For almost 200 years, the Templars were powerful beyond the scope of most kings, with legendary fighting abilities and fabulous treasures. Could there really be a connection between this long-gone medieval order and the middle-class men who mumble Masonic ritual behind closed doors in just about every sizable town in the westernized world? At face value, they seem so far apart that it would take a massive amount of evidence to claim a direct relationship. But as we looked at the devils, I don't know where I got devil. As we looked at the details of both side by side, the disparity between the two began to shrink surprisingly rapidly. The Muslims had ruled Jerusalem since the 7th century and had allowed Jews and Christians access to the city, which was important to all 3 religions for different reasons. Toward the end of the 11th century, Seljuk Turks took control of Jerusalem and banned Christians from making pilgrimages. The powers of Christendom were unhappy at this state of affairs and mobilized their forces to recapture the land of Jesus. Despite the purity of the apparent motive behind them, the so-called Crusades, the battles for control of the Holy Land, were hard-fought, merciless conflicts. The crude and self-seeking Christian invaders from the north believed that the Muslims were in the habit of swallowing their gold and jewelry to hide them in times of crisis, and consequently many Muslims died in agony with their bellies torn open as white infidel fingers probed their entrails for non-existent valuables. The Jews of Jerusalem fared little better. They had lived happily side by side with the Muslims for hundreds of years, and on 14 June 1099 they died beside them. The bloodlust of the Crusaders knew no bounds. One Crusader, Raymond of Aguilers, was moved by the sight of the devastated city and the mutilated corpses of its residents to quote Psalm 118, quote, "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad of it," end quote. In the years that followed the capture of Jerusalem, Christians from all over Europe began to make the pilgrimage to the Holy City, a journey so long and arduous that a fit body and a strong constitution were needed to survive it. The growing number of pilgrims traveling from the ports of Acre, Tyre, and Jaffa to the city of Jerusalem created problems, and an infrastructure had to be created to provide for them. An important part of these arrangements was the Amalfi hostelry in Jerusalem, which was established by the Knights Hospitaller to provide food and lodgings for the constant flow of travelers. The importance and wealth of the small and obscure order of monks who ran it grew in proportion to the increasing number of visitors, and the new Christian rulers of the city rewarded their efforts with generous gifts. The order developed quickly, and its prior must have been an ambitious and politically astute individual, as he took the unusual step of creating a military arm by accepting knights to join, after which he changed the title of the order to the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. It obtained papal blessing in 1118 when it was provided with a formal constitution known as a rule. This was an organization which probably influenced a French nobleman from Champagne by the name of Hugh de Payan, because in the same year he and 8 other knights established the unofficial order of the Poor Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. According to tradition, King Baldwin II, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, readily gave his support to the new order and provided quarters for them in the eastern part of his palace, which adjoined the former Al-Aqsa Mosque and stood on the site of King Solomon's Temple. The Templars, as they are now usually called, were said to have come into existence for the purpose of providing protection for the increasing flow of pilgrims as they made their hazardous journeys between the coastal port of Jaffa and Jerusalem. All of these original knights were laymen who took an oath to live as though they were monks, in poverty, chastity, and with obedience. Initially they wore no special clothing, but they said prayers at regular intervals, and in every way they behaved as though they were members of a religious order. Sometime in 1118, these 9 knights apparently arrived from France and appointed themselves guardians of the Judean desert roads leading to Jerusalem. This standard account struck us as odd. Why had these Frenchmen set themselves a task which was extremely optimistic at best and foolhardy at worst? Even a small band of Saracen insurgents would surely have overwhelmed them, no matter how well trained and armed they were. Surprisingly, we found the Fulcher of Chartres, Baldwin II's chaplain, did not make a single mention of them in his extensive chronicles that cover the first 9 years of the unofficial order's existence. The earliest certain evidence of the Templars dates from 1121, when a certain Count Fulk V of Anjou lodged with the Templars and thereafter left them an annuity of 30 Angevin livres. Sorry if I'm butchering those words. Team Never Tilt. Hey, how's it going? Good. Even mutilated corpses and good evening, mutilated corpses and thriving rejoicers. From the evidence available, it seems clear that the band of 9 knights did not expand for a long time after its establishment. It was not until after they had spent no less than 9 years in their lodgings on the site of Herod's temple that Hugh de Payan left for the west in search of worthy recruits who would swell the order to a size more appropriate to the fulfillment of its self-proclaimed mission. What were they searching for? We instinctively felt that there was something wrong here. There is no evidence that these founding Templars ever gave protection to pilgrims. But on the other hand, we were soon to find that there is conclusive proof that they did conduct extensive excavations under the ruins of Herod's temple. We soon realized that many other writers had had reservations about the accepted version of the Templars' aims. The more we looked, the more we came across theories about the real motives of the Templars. In one, the French historian Gaetan de la Forge commented, quote, "The real task of the 9 Knights was to carry out research in the area in order to obtain certain relics and manuscripts which contain the essence of the secret traditions of Judaism and ancient Egypt, some of which probably went back to the days of Moses." End quote. This comment was used by the researcher and author Graham Hancock in arguing that these knights were not what they seemed. He concluded that the temple site itself was the focus of their interest, and that there is evidence of their major excavations. He quotes from an Israeli archaeologist's official report, which established that these 9 knights were searching the temple ruins for something unknown. Quote, "The tunnel leads inwards for a distance of about 30 meters from the southern wall before being blocked by pieces of stone debris. We know that it continues further, but we had made it a hard and fast rule not to excavate within the bounds of the Temple Mount, which is currently under Muslim jurisdiction, without first acquiring the permission of the appropriate Muslim authorities. In this case, they permitted us only to measure and photograph the exposed section of the tunnel, not to conduct excavation of any kind. Upon concluding this work, we sealed up the tunnel's exit with stones." End quote. We found further evidence that the Templars had been involved in digging for something under the ruins of Herod's temple in the writings of Lieutenant Charles Wilson of the Royal Engineers, who led an archaeological expedition to Jerusalem at the turn of the century. He recovered many old items that can be positively identified as Templar artifacts from diggings deep below the temple. As our researches for this book were nearing completion, we had the good fortune to meet Robert Brydon, a scholarly Templar archivist based in Scotland, who now has many of these items in his care. Our motive for looking at the origins of the Templars was to try and confirm any direct connection between their order and modern Freemasonry. As we absorbed the known facts and read official and unofficial perspectives on the first Templars, we concluded that it was clear they were indeed excavating the temple. The questions we needed answers to were, what were they looking for, and much more importantly, what did they actually find? Other writers have speculated that they may have been looking for the lost treasures of the temple, searching for the Holy Grail, or even trying to find the Ark of the Covenant itself. These speculations may well be correct, but of course, we were more interested in what they actually found rather than what they originally set out to locate. For 9 years, then, these 9 devoted treasure hunters had excavated the site of the great temples of the Jews, and during this time they had not sought to or allowed any further knights entrance to their order, living solely on the charity of Baldwin. All must have gone reasonably well year after year as they traveled through solid rock, inching closer and closer to the base of the Holy of Holies. But then something happened to change the basic plan. It occurred to us that it was probably something less than a coincidence, that Hugh de Payon's journey west to find recruits for the first time happened just months after the death of their benefactor Baldwin in October 1126. Had they run out of funds and food before their unknown task was completed? Or did they wait for Baldwin to die in order to cut him out of any share of treasure? The rule of the order. It appears that Payon's journey had been prompted by a real fear for the continuance of their group. A letter he wrote as he traveled through Europe clearly illustrated his concern that his fellow knights back in Jerusalem needed their convictions bolstering. Probably meant to say bolstered there. It referred to the knight's original vocation being weakened by the devil, and went on to quote biblical passages to reassure his remaining 7 knights. There were only 7 left back on the Temple Mount as Payan was accompanied on his journey by André de Montbard, the uncle of the very young but highly influential Abbot of Clairvaux, destined to become Saint Bernard. It must have been his family connection that took him first to Bernard, who was clearly impressed by the story he heard from his uncle. Bernard's words promoting their campaign for assistance left little doubt about his opinion of these knights from Jerusalem. Quote, "They go not headlong into battle, but with care and foresight, peacefully as true children of Israel. But as soon as the fight has begun, they rush without delay upon the foe, and know no fear. And one has often put to flight 1,000, 2 10,000, and gentler than lambs and grimmer than lions. Theirs is the mildness of monks and the valor of the knight." End quote. The future Saint Bernard quickly brought the fledgling order to the attention of Pope Honorius II, asking that his adopted little band of knights from Jerusalem should be provided with a rule, a constitution of their own that laid out requirements for conduct and practice which would give them legitimacy and defined status within the church. This was finally granted on 31 January 1128, when Hugh de Payan appeared before the specially convened Council of Troyes. This impressive body was presided over by the Cardinal of Albano, the papal legate, and comprised the archbishops of Reims and Sens. I know I'm not pronouncing those right. No fewer than 10 bishops and a number of abbots, including Bernard himself. The proposition was carried, and the Templars were given the right to wear their own mantles, which at that time were pure white, as well as receiving their rule. To the whole world they were now truly monks as well as knights. What fascinated us about the rule given to the Templars was not so much what it said, but much what it did not say. Nowhere was there any mention of pilgrims or their protection. Strange, we thought, how the apparent sole reason for creating the order could be so totally overlooked. By this point, we were convinced that something very mysterious was at the center of the founding of the Templar order. The original 9 knights had long been extremely reluctant to take in new recruits, but now they were forced by the need for funds, extra workers, and perhaps even clerics to change their attitude. Their new rule made joining members probationers for the first year and required from them an immediate vow of poverty, so a new brother had to hand over his personal wealth to the order. All candidates were required to have been born in wedlock, be of noble birth, be free from any vow or tie, and be of sound body. Under admission, the accepted brother owned only his sword and nothing else. He had no identity apart from his sword, which he dedicated to the service of the order. When he died, his grave carried no inscription, being marked only with a rectangular stone into which the shape of his sword was carved. Immediately after the granting of their rule, the Templars' circumstances went from strength to strength. They gained the support of scores of influential landowners, and donations started to arrive from all corners of the Christian world. Bernard had convinced the Pope of their worth, and suddenly they became the fashionable cause, with wealth being thrust upon them. When Hugh de Payan and André de Montbard returned to Jerusalem a mere 2 years after setting out, the level of their success was outstanding. They had gone west with nothing and come back with a papal rule, money, precious objects, landed wealth, and no less than 300 recruited noblemen to follow Hugh de Payan's lead as Grand Master of a major order. Hugh de Payan must have been producing something very tangible to generate such interest and support. With our curiosity mounting, we looked further into what is still known of these warrior monks.
The new members of the order were sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience, but whether or not this rule was applied retrospectively to the founders is never mentioned. Certainly Hugh de Payens remained married to Catherine de St. Clair, a Scottish woman of Norman descent, and set up the first Templar preceptory outside the Holy Land on her family's land in Scotland, a fact that would later turn out to be of major relevance. Entrants were obliged to cut their hair, but forbidden to cut their beards. This is where the image of the Templar crusader with the long flowing beard arose. Diet, dress, and all other aspects of their daily lives were controlled by the rule. In particular, their behavior on the battlefield was strictly ordered. Templars were not allowed to ask for mercy or to ransom themselves, but were compelled to fight to the death. They were never allowed to retreat unless the odds against them exceeded 3 to 1, and whilst history shows that they ultimately lost, it is also clear from Muslim as well as Christian records that the order was both feared and respected for its fighting skills. We were amazed to find that about 10 years after the granting of their original Latin rule, the Templars began to think so highly of themselves that they unilaterally developed a French rule to replace the former with one in the working language of the members of the order. The fact that they had the confidence to do this illustrates the power and independence that the Templars enjoyed. This new rule contained several significant changes, but intriguingly, it still made no mention of the protection of pilgrims. It did away with the requirement for a probationary year for novices and turned one highly important rule on its head, instantly changing the legal basis of the order. In the Latin rule, an instruction read, quote, "Moreover, where non-excommunicated knights are gathered, you must go," end quote. However, in the translated and amended French rule, the same sentence became, quote, "We command you to go where excommunicated knights are gathered," end quote. This can only imply that they were outside Vatican law. There can be no possibility that this was simply an error of translation, as the clerics were working in their own language, not some unfamiliar script, and such a total reversal of meaning would have been spotted by the rest of the order, even if the original scribe made a mistake. Taken with what we now know of the Templars, both their arrogance and their suspected deviation from the Church of Rome, it is entirely understandable that they dared to write such a thing, but we could not find anything to indicate what their reason might have been. Eventually, the Templars' luck was to run out. The Pope and Philip, King of France, moved in on the errant order, bringing it to its knees in just one terrible day, Friday the 13th, October 1307. Ever since that day, the number 13 has been considered unlucky, and a Friday the 13th of any month has become a date to keep any overly superstitious person indoors clinging to their lucky rabbit's foot. And actually, for me, Friday the 13th is always a very lucky day. So, there you go. The seal of the order. The first seal of the Templars depicted 2 knights riding on a single horse, and it is usually claimed that this is a device to signify the poverty to which the members were sworn. Excuse me. In that they could not... excuse me. Sorry about that. Let's see, 2 knights riding on a single horse, and it is usually claimed that this is a device to signify their poverty, to which the members were sworn, in that they could not afford a mount for every knight. This would have made them a very inefficient fighting force had it been based on truth. The French rule, however, states that the master, quote, must have 4 horses, and 1 chaplain brother, and 1 clerk with 3 horses, and 1 sergeant brother with 2 horses, and 1 gentleman valet to carry his shield and lance with 1 horse. Clearly, there was no shortage of available mounts. Oh, sorry, with 1 horse, end quote. Clearly, there was no shortage of available mounts. It occurred to us that this seal might represent the 2 grades of knights within the one order, those who were more advanced, who were allowed to share in the Templar secret, and those in the back seat who did not. Man, this interpretation of the seal is, of course, pure speculation, but it seems certain that they did not have a secret. That they did have a secret. Sorry, I misread that. That they did have a secret, and once the Templars had done away with the 12-month probationary period, they would have needed some method to protect themselves from unproven and potentially untrustworthy newcomers. Organization of the Order. The Order did not consist only of knights. There were 2 lesser classes besides the full brothers. The first were known as sergeants, who were recruited from what we would now describe as the working class, rather than the nobility that was the source of the knights. They undertook such positions as grooms, stewards, sentries, and general support troops. Like their betters, they wore a red cross, but the mantle itself was a dark brown rather than white, reflecting their lack of purity in relation to knights of the order. The other group comprised the clerics, who looked after the spiritual needs of the knights. They were the only literate members of the order, and were themselves priests, taking care of record keeping and communications, sometimes writing in very complex codes. French was a spoken and administrative language of the Templars, but these versatile priests could say the Mass in Latin, haggle with local traders in Arabic, and be quite capable of reading the Old Testament in Hebrew and the New Testament in Greek. They served the spiritual needs of the fighting men, and were distinguished by the wearing of the Templar cross on a green mantle. These clerics would consecrate the bread and wine at the Eucharist like a modern day priest, but they took their duty so seriously that they were said to wear white gloves at all times except when actually handling the host during the service. As the bread was the body of Christ, it was important not to soil it with the dirt of profane day to day activities, and white gloves were worn to keep their hands clean enough to handle the body of God. This wearing of white gloves was to us an obvious parallel with the modern Freemason, who always wears white gloves to his lodge meetings. No reason has ever been given for this practice. Could this, we wondered, be a Templar connection? Another distant echo of current Masonic practice lies in the Templars' use of sheepskin as their only permitted form of decoration, as well as the requirement that their rule that they were to wear tight sheepskin breeches beneath their outer clothing at all times as a symbol of innocence and chastity. It is an alarming thought in this age of personal hygiene, but these conscientious knights did not remove their breeches even to wash themselves. After a few days, let alone the many decades that many of them spent under the desert sun, their chastity must have been totally guaranteed. Whilst free, yeah, whilst Freemasons today do not wear breeches, they do wear white lambskin aprons in lodge meetings, which we were told is the badge of innocence and the emblem of friendship. One more similarity struck us as pointing to a possible Templar connection. We found that the buisson, the Templar battle flag, consisted of 2 vertical blocks, one white and one black. The black symbolizing the world of sin the knight had left behind to enter the order, and the white reflecting the move from darkness to light. The modern Freemason's lodge always displays at its center a pattern of black and white squares, and at lodge meetings every brother wears a white shirt with a black tie and suit. If he does not, he will not be admitted as he is not properly clothed. No one has ever explained why Freemasons wear lambskin and black and white in order to be considered properly clothed. The only reason offered is that, quote, our ancient brethren always dressed this way, end quote. Whilst these are a number of whilst there are a number of parallels here, we did not seek to make too great a play on these similarities, as we wanted to be sure that we were not starting to see what we wanted to see. These powerful coincidences were circumstantial pieces of evidence, but they did fuel our enthusiasm for exploring the connection between the two orders more closely. We now had a burning question. What had the Knights Templar found which had so influenced their development? Conclusion. We now knew that the Templars had painstakingly excavated the ruins of Herod's temple, and that the downfall of the order came as a result of accusations of heresy. If the Templars did hold heretical beliefs and conduct strange rituals, it seemed to be a real possibility that these could have originated with a document or documents found by them. Had these 12th century knights uncovered any ancient texts, they would have been in an almost unique position at that time to interpret and appreciate them. Whilst the knights themselves are believed to have been illiterate, their clerics were able to read and write in many languages and were famous for their abilities to create and break ciphers. We pursued this avenue as our best guess, unaware that evidence of a Templar find was almost under our noses in the ritual of a Masonic degree that neither of us had joined. And that is the end of that chapter. So, we're going to leave it off there tonight. 2 chapters is enough for me. To read out loud, anyway. Excuse me. Wow. So, we'll pick this up on Friday, and that'll be it for tonight. I think I'm done. I'm not going to raid tonight. I usually try to raid on every night, but Mondays, but I'm not feeling up to it. So I'm going to just leave it off there, and I will see you all on Friday. Have a good night.
Shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I've had, but more sophisticated into love real